Hey everybody, and welcome to another Darkest Dungeon mod overview. My name is ElementFive, and tonight we're taking a look at Muscarine's The Shrapnel. Now, the Shrapnel holds sort of an interesting place in my heart, partly because over the first half of the last year, learning to stream and playing a lot of modded Darkest Dungeon, a lot of that focus was on Muscarine's modded classes, just sort of a natural selection of finding modded classes that had just superb animation and artwork and class balance, etc. And then was fortunate enough to get to know him and really get to sort of study a lot of how his classes work, how to manage them correctly, how to play them optimally. And then, of course, we went through, we used his Profligates group to go through the Crimson Court and then into the end game. And then finally, once we beat the end game, we were all very pleasantly excited to know that he was producing a new modded class, which would be the Shrapnel, a backline mark-dependent ranged character that would really set itself apart from the rest of his classes. Now, she also is a character that speaks to me in certain ways, partly because she is bionic, she doesn't have arms, and she sort of has these attachments at the end of her arms where she will unpack herself and then place these guns there. So she's kind of a melding of man and machine, and that speaks to a lot of my theming around the stream and the stuff we do with mecha and artificial intelligence and robotics and stuff like that. But she's also just a cool character because she has a deeper story, and in her case, she's actually, her backstory revolves around her being an original member of Wolf's crew. You get to know Wolf at one point when there's wolves at the door in the game. Well, she happened to be his main mistress at one point, and then was nearly killed by the Hamlet militia during a raid, then found near death by the ancestor, taking her in, sort of like he did with the creatures in the Warrens and with Muscarine's other class, the Fawn, experimenting on the Shrapnel to sort of see if he could meld man and machine. Of course, the Shrapnel getting away from that situation and then really becoming an outcast and being hated as an outcast, now set on her way and enact revenge for what he did to her. So that whole backstory, which ties into her origin in the Hamlet, is all very interesting, but like Muscarine's other classes, it is also a deeper symbolism about the way it is to live in a world as an outcast and to be sort of hated as an outcast, and to harbor a sense of dislike or hatred for other people because they treat you that way, but also to have to depend on those people and work with them to move forward. And this is very much evident in not only her attitude, but definitely a lot of the sort of way that her mechanics and camping skills are written and themed, but also just the fact that a lot of her abilities are dependent on other people. If she is a mark-dependent class, and if she doesn't land her marks, she really relies on another class to throw those marks down so that she can hit anything. Now again, she is a mark-dependent transformation class. She comes out of the stagecoach having all of her abilities unlocked, and because she's mark-dependent, you typically will fare very well if you bring her along in a group with some other mark synergy, like an occultist or bounty hunter or arbalist or somebody who's going to help back up and set up marks for her to actually hit things and hit them hard, or to benefit from the marks she puts out. And it's important to understand that she is a transformation class, as I said, so she's basically in two different states. She's either packed up or deployed, and that is represented here by her abilities on the left and right side. So she has two primary openers, which then will put her in a position to deploy her guns. And then once she is deployed, you will switch into her offensive kit, which have a lot of different utility and damage output, and are all basically contextual. Depends on where the marks land in your party and what you're fighting and what you want to do with them. So I think the most fun thing about this class is she is definitely tactical in the sense that she can adapt to circumstance. I have definitely played her against all kinds of different bosses. She fares very well against rank 3 and 4 bosses like the Hag, or even the Brigand Pounder, for example. We had a fun clip about, gun versus gun play where she really crushed the Brigand Pounder and kept the matchman at bay very well. But in general, you're going to think about taking her with mark groups and, most importantly, starting her in position 1 or 2. And that is because her two opening abilities here, either overclocking or vent, start her in position 1 or 2, then move her back to rank 4, and then set her up to transform, unload, and then use her offensive kit. So that is I just can't understate that enough. Most people don't get this piece here, which is that you are opening with either one of these abilities in rank 2, which pushes her back to rank 4, to which you then use entrenchment, bring out her guns, and then you will use her offensive kit. But before we go into her offensive kit and how she works, let's just take a look at her stats real quick. For the most part, underwhelming in terms of anything that stands out very interesting. She has decent crit and damage, and that's expected. Her speed is sort of interesting, but ultimately the really interesting takeaways of her stats is that she has basically no trap disarm or trap resist, and that is just due to the fact that she does not have arms. She's just not very agile. And again, that is tied into, I think, the concept of her being reliant on other people. As well, she has very high move resist and very decent bleed resist. And this also ties in conceptually and mechanically to the fact that she is sort of dependent on shuffling back to the back line and then staying there through most of the encounter. But also because she's mana machine, there's not a lot to bleed. Okay, so now that we understand just a basic idea of who she is and how she works in a group and the kind of groups that she can work in, let's break down her kit. So first, let's take a look at overclocking. So overclocking, I think, is her primary opener. And this is because this is where she's going to really set herself up to do what she needs to do. Overclocking is usable in position 1 or 2 only. It targets all of the enemies. It will send her back to rank 4. And then this is the interesting part. It has a 71% chance at level 3 to mark each individual enemy, at the cost of stressing herself out and a 75% chance of 100% blight resist and stun resist. So let's take a look at her other opener then, which is Vent. So Vent is also only usable in position 1 or 2, sends her to the back line in rank 4, but this is a self de-stress, buff self 8% prot and 3 speed at level 3, and debuff self 10% max HP, which lasts 14 rounds. So Vent is then a way for you to manage this character's stress gain from using overclocking. So you use overclocking and you use her really aggressively. She's marking enemy targets. She is stressing herself out by overclocking constantly and bringing her guns out. And then every once in a while you can cool her off with Vent and use that as an opener instead. The important piece to note here is that using Vent will not set marks on enemy targets. So you'll be setting her back into position 4, and you need to rely on other teammates then to mark things, or use another one of her abilities to mark things instead. So then next we have Entrenchment, which is just her transformation ability. So again, you're going to open with one of these two, and then you're going to, once she's in position 4, use Entrenchment in either position 3 or 4. It will change from Pact to change to mode Deploy, and then once the combat is ended, she will go back to Pact. So when she's packed up, you're opening with these two, then you deploy her guns, and then once combat ends, you go back to Pact. So now that we understand that you are starting her in position 1 or 2, you're using one of her openers, and then you're deploying her guns, we can look at her offensive kit. And that starts with Fragmentation. Fragmentation, only usable in rank 4, targets all enemies, is a ranged ability that has a 130% chance at level 3 to bleed all enemy targets for a 1/3. You get plus 40 accuracy versus marked. And it also comes with a chance to debuff the enemies with crits received. So Fragmentation then is a really wonderful opener in the Warrens or the Weald, or typically where you're going to be fighting enemies that are weaker to bleeds, but of course is dependent on things being marked to really work at its full potential. Nonetheless, this is a very dependable ability that for the most part is a nice way to just hit the enemy team with a decent round of damage and potentially land some bleeds. So next in her offensive kit then is Flush Out. So Flush Out can be used in any rank, and it will target all enemies. It will send her back 3 to the back line, and this is the important piece. This is really just about utility, this ability. So this will bypass stealth, de-stealth enemies, break guard, has a 60% chance to mark the enemy targets, and then debuffs them for -8 dodge. So the way to think about Flush Out is this. First of all, if for any reason you get shuffled into a position up front, and you can't use something like fragmentation, well then Flush Out is going to get you back in a position where you can be aggressive again. The other thing here is that just if for some reason you start with Vent as opposed to overclocking, or you forget to rearrange the team in between combats and she starts in rank 4, then Flush Out is a decent opener because it also has a 60% chance to mark targets, similar to but not quite as effective as the way overclocking does. And then of course, if any of the enemies are stealthed or guarded, this is a perfect way to just bring those enemies out of that protective state, that defensive state, and then make them vulnerable again. So next in her offensive kit then is Mow Down. Mow Down can be usable in rank 3 or 4, and it targets both rank 2 and 3 of the enemies. It basically does very, very decent damage with plus 40 accuracy versus marked. So the way I think about using Mow Down is, again, seeing where my marks landed after using either overclocking or Flush Out. If I only landed a couple marks and they happen to be in rank position 2 or 3, or in general, there happens to be a stressor or a ranged damage dealer or something right at about rank 3, and Mow Down is a great way to just focus a little bit more aggressive damage, a little bit higher damage numbers on that back line. So last but not least is Expunge. Expunge is a very interesting ability because it comes with a unique provision that Muscarine added to this class, and conceptually is just very cool in my mind. Expunge can only be used in rank 4. It can hit any enemy in any rank. It does 80% damage versus marked, with 40 accuracy versus marked, and 40% armor piercing, and it comes at a very hefty cost of debuffing self minus 120 accuracy for a couple rounds. So then the way to really capitalize on Expunge, then the way to use it, is to pay attention to her ammo pack provisions. So she starts with a few of these defaultly. You get a few of these for free when you go into a dungeon. Of course, you can purchase a few more of them if you want to, if you think you're going to be using a lot of Expunges. But this is a pretty fun ability because really, again, conceptually, you are expunging your entire ammo clip of ammunition into one specific target to just take it out of the battle or to do just a ton of damage to it. So the cost then of that is the minus 120 accuracy for 2 rounds. It basically means you're going to unload your entire clip of ammo into one target, and then the next round you need to spend that time reloading, essentially. In which case you could probably try to land fragmentations or use Flush Out and maybe use some of the utility with that, but for the most part you're going to be punished for a round by doing that much focused fire. Now, it should just be said again that the part of the fun of this class is just really thinking situationally about which aggressive ability you want to use when. Am I opening up with overclocking and marking a ton of things? Great, I landed a bunch of marks on all these pigs and swine in the warrens. Well, let's start bleeding them and do a ton of damage with fragmentation because this has 40% accuracy versus marked. Maybe we opened with overclocking, or we even used Flush Out, and we landed only marks on position 2 or 3. So now Mow Down makes a lot more sense to use because we're going to get that 40 accuracy versus marked. Maybe we happen to be up against a particular group with a very high priority target in the back that is just going to crush our team unless we can just take it out now. Well, now it's time to pop an ammo clip and then use Expunge and just murder it at the cost of her being, for the most part, out of combat for the next round. So she's a lot of fun, and all you have to do is just understand the importance of starting her in position 1 or 2 so that you can send her to the back, see where your marks landed. If they didn't, see if you want to try a fragmentation or mow down one of her abilities, or try to land some more marks, or have one of her teammates land a mark for her. Really, the way to think about getting good at her is just opening with overclocking, for example, sending her to the back line, then using entrenchment to bring her guns out, then just using something like fragmentation and mousing over each of the enemies to see what your accuracy is and see what your likelihood to hit them is. Again, with the Color of Madness update, an accuracy rating of 95% chance to hit means you're guaranteed to hit that thing. So if you're not so certain that you're going to hit it, maybe don't waste your turn and try to actually single out where the marks landed, and that's all you need to do. Now, in terms of her camping skills, most of her utility is really centered around de-stressing herself, her self-management, buffing her damage, and they reflect a lot of sort of her personality and background. So first we can just take a look at maintenance. Maintenance, an incredibly efficient time cost 2 for a 20% self-only damage buff for the next 4 battles, at the cost of damaging another companion by 10% HP. So there's a lot to say about maintenance, and we can just start by pointing out the fact that it is a really significant damage buff for only a time cost 2, and for only a cost of 10% HP damage, which is really just minimal when you think about it. But conceptually, this is her needing, leaning on another group member to help her sort of tune her weapons, and that comes at the cost of that companion's time and energy, essentially. So the next is Despicable. Despicable is a time cost 2, self-only minus 30 stress at the cost of all other companions gaining 8 stress. So this is, again, a means to help you manage her as you continually use overclocking as her opener over and over, stressing herself out and building her stress up. And then you can camp and bring that stress down rather than having to use a lot of vent, which can be a lot less efficient in terms of getting damage out. But it also plays into, her backstory, her lore, her persona as being somebody who is constantly sort of despicable as a group member. Just somebody who's unpleasant, who's kind of an outcast, who harbors resentment about being treated as an outcast. And so she's taking care of herself, she's de-stressing herself at the cost of sort of pissing other people off. The next is Honed. Honed is a time cost 3, self-only, 20% chance party surprised, plus 20% move resist. So this is actually pretty interesting tactically because, again, she is a sort of rank 4 dependent, mark dependent class. So if you're doing, say, torchless runs where, your party is being surprised a lot, and you're being shuffled a lot and you're not able to open with your openers as much as you want to, or reliably, or for some reason she is being sort of pulled out of the back line for some reason, this is a nice preventative measure to just keep her doing exactly what she needs to do in an efficient way. Keep her in position 1 or 2 at the start of battle, then open with overclocking, send her back to the back line, entrench and take out her guns, and then do her damage. So Honed is just a nice way to just keep her doing what she needs to do. And then last is Renewed Hatred. Renewed Hatred at time cost 4, self-only 7% crit buff for 4 battles, which is pretty decent when you think about that, but also a remove mortality debuff. So if she should be hit and reaches death's door, this is a nice way to sort of remove that mortality debuff, but also buff her damage. So, for a time cost 6, you could buff her damage 20% as well as 7% crit and just make her hit even that much harder. And that's really not too bad if she is one of your primary damage dealers, and assuming that you're in a pretty strong mark group and you're using her appropriately, you could get a lot out of that. For another 2 more, for time cost total 8, you could bring her stress down and just really manage her very well. So all in all, I think a very interesting kit. Now, Musk has told me that he's thought about maybe changing these camping skills a little bit, maybe buffing them in certain ways. So we might see some changes down the line, and we've definitely seen some changes to the way that she plays mechanically and the way that she involves her ammo packs But all in all, I find her to be a really fun and for the most part pretty simple class to play. It just again comes down to making sure that you are prioritizing keeping her in position 1 or 2 so she can use one of her openers, preferably overclocking, to then send her to the back line, open up with her guns, and then have the most efficiency out of her accuracy and her ability to just crush things with her offensive kit. And believe me, she will crush things if you use her appropriately, especially if you consider some of the trinkets that you could bring in to sort of buff and ramp her damage. I mean, of course, the Ancestor's Pistol, the 3 speed, the 15 accuracy for range skills at the cost of a little bit more stress, the silver casings, her unique shrapnel only silver bullets, which do extra damage versus Unholy versus Eldritch, and 20% damage versus Bloodsuckers. When you think about it, this looks really powerful, and it is, because it doesn't really have much of a downside to it at all, other than to just take into consideration that for the most part, you're either fighting Unholy or Eldritch or Bloodsuckers most of the time. So you're not really getting a ton of benefit out of this, but it is still a pretty damn good trinket that really boosts her damage. And the only other thing to really consider is the importance of her speed value. You know, because she is going to be opening in position 2 and then moving to position 4, hopefully landing marks on the enemy team, that can be a really, really amazing way to set up the next few steps of your combat and just gain the initiative. So if you can prioritize her going first, that can be pretty helpful and really make her that much more powerful and efficient. Again, if you're new to Darkest Dungeon and you don't understand the way speed works, speed is a number value plus a dice roll 8, which will then determine at the beginning of the turn which character goes first, enemies and your own group. So again, having this number higher means a better likelihood that she's going to act first, move to the position she needs to be, bring out her guns, and mark things to set up your bounty hunter, your arbalist, your other marked targets to just come over and capitalize. As always, I'll make sure to include the link to download her from Steam in the information below the video, as well as a link to the rest of Muscarine's modded content, which includes her Crimson Court trinkets, as well as her new Color of Madness trinket pack. Thank you so much for watching. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this brief overview of Muscarine's the Shrapnel. I really love this class, both in concept and in play. If used appropriately, she can be absolutely devastating. So take her out, have a good time, and we'll see you next time.